I thought it was just leftover pizza, the kind of greasy, day-old slice that tastes even better cold at midnight when you're too tired to cook. I grabbed it from the fridge, took 3 big bites, and headed back to my room. That's when everything went wrong. First, my tongue started tingling. Not the good kind of tingle you get from spicy food. This was different. Sharp. Wrong. Then my throat began to close. I stumbled back into the kitchen, gasping like a fish out of water. My chest felt like someone was sitting on it, crushing my ribs one by one. The room started spinning and I could taste metal in my mouth. That's when I knew I was dying. I managed to call 911 before collapsing on the kitchen floor. The last thing I remember clearly was staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was really how my story would end. Over a slice of pizza, the ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and oxygen masks. I drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversations between the paramedics. Severe allergic reaction, pulse dropping, need to get him there fast. But here's the thing that still haunts me to this day. Jake was there in the ambulance with me. My roommate, my so-called friend, holding my hand and telling me everything would be okay. The paramedics probably thought he was being supportive, caring even. But right before I lost consciousness completely, I caught something that made my blood run cold. He was smirking. Not a worried expression. Not fear for my life. A satisfied little smile, like he was watching his favorite movie reach the climax. In that split second before everything went black, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't an accident. When you're dying, your mind does strange things. Time slows down. Details become crystal clear. And in those final moments of consciousness, I understood that the person sitting next to me, the person I trusted enough to live with, had tried to kill me. The question that kept echoing in my fading mind was simple. Why? What I didn't know then was that this wasn't Jake's first time playing this sick game, and I definitely wasn't going to be his last victim. 6 months earlier, I was desperate. Moving to the city for my new job seemed like a dream come true until I started apartment hunting. Everything decent was way out of my budget unless I found a roommate. I posted on every website I could find. Clean, quiet professional seeking, same for 2-bedroom downtown. Jake was the third person to respond, and honestly, he seemed too good to be true. His email was perfectly written, no typos, proper grammar, even a professional headshot attached. He worked in tech, made good money, had excellent references from previous landlords. When we met for coffee, he showed up early, wore a crisp button-down shirt, and even paid for my latte. "I'm pretty low-key," he said, stirring his coffee methodically. "I travel for work sometimes, so you'd have the place to yourself. I just want someone reliable who won't throw parties or leave dishes in the sink." Perfect, right? That should have been my first red flag. Nobody's that perfect. Within a week, we'd signed the lease, and I was moving my stuff into our shared apartment. Jake helped carry boxes, organized our shared kitchen supplies, even bought a welcome mat that said, "Home Sweet Home." I remember thinking I'd hit the roommate lottery. The first warning sign came during our second week living together. I was eating cereal at the kitchen counter when I noticed Jake watching me from the doorway. Not just glancing, staring intensely, like he was studying me. "Good cereal?" he asked, but something about his tone felt off. "Yeah, just the usual," I mumbled, suddenly self-conscious about every bite. He did this thing where he'd tilt his head slightly and smile. Not a normal smile. It never reached his eyes. "You're very trusting," he said. "Most people don't eat food around strangers." I laughed it off. "We're roommates, not strangers." "Right," he said, but he kept watching until I finished the entire bowl. Then there were his stories about work. Jake claimed to be in tech, but whenever I asked specifics, he'd change the subject. He talked constantly about social experiments and how easy it was to manipulate people's behavior. He'd describe elaborate pranks he'd pulled on coworkers, always ending with, "They never saw it coming." "People are so gullible," he'd say, usually while I was cooking or eating. "They trust too easily." Don't you think that's dangerous? I started noticing other things too. How he'd rearrange items in the apartment just slightly. moving my keys to different hooks, switching the salt and pepper shakers, hiding my mail under magazines. When I'd mention it, he'd laugh and say I was being paranoid. "You're too sensitive," became his favorite phrase. Learned to take a joke. But the biggest red flag? The way he talked about his previous roommates. There had been 3 of them in the past 2 years. According to Jake, they were all crazy, or couldn't handle his sense of humor. One had apparently freaked out over nothing, and moved out, in the middle of the night. Looking back, I should have run. Should have trusted my gut when it told me something was fundamentally wrong with Jake. Instead, I convinced myself I was overreacting. After all, what's the worst that could happen with a few harmless pranks? Jake's pranks started small and seemingly innocent. First, it was switching the sugar and salt in our containers. I discovered this the hard way when my morning coffee tasted like ocean water. Jake found my gagging absolutely hilarious. "Your face," he wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. Classic. I tried to be a good sport. We were roommates, right? A little harmless fun never hurt anyone. So I laughed along and even got him back by putting plastic wrap over the toilet seat. When he fell for it the next morning, I felt pretty clever. But Jake didn't just laugh when he found my prank. He studied it, took photos, asked detailed questions about how long it took me to set up and whether I'd done anything like this before. "Interesting technique," he said, like he was analyzing a chess move. Very interesting. The pranks escalated quickly after that. Jake started hiding my keys in increasingly difficult places, inside the freezer, taped under the kitchen table, even buried in the soil of my houseplant. What started as a minor inconvenience became a daily treasure hunt that made me late for work multiple times. "It's just a game," he'd say when I complained. "Don't be so uptight." Then he moved on to my personal belongings. I'd find my important documents, lease papers, work contracts, medical records, scattered throughout the apartment or sometimes completely missing. Jake would always find them eventually, acting like the hero who'd discovered them in some random location. "Weird," he'd say, handing me my birth certificate from inside a cereal box. No idea how that got there. The morning I woke up to find my work laptop missing was the morning I realized this wasn't about pranks anymore. I was supposed to give a presentation that day, a presentation that could make or break my quarterly review. I tore the apartment apart looking for it. "Jake," I called out, panic rising in my voice. "Have you seen my laptop?" He emerged from his room, already dressed and ready for work, with that same tilted head smile. "Laptop? Did you check the bathroom?" I found it in the shower, thankfully undamaged, but definitely hidden on purpose. When I confronted Jake, he just shrugged. "Relax, it was waterproof anyway." I checked the specs online first. That's when it hit me. He'd researched my laptop before hiding it. This wasn't impulsive, it was calculated. The pranks got more personal, more targeted. Jake somehow figured out I had a phone interview scheduled and changed every alarm in the apartment to go off 2 hours later than they should. I missed the call entirely. When the company called back to reschedule, they seemed less enthusiastic about my candidacy. "Oops," Jake said when I told him what happened. "Must have been a glitch with the power or something. Technology, am I right?" But the worst part wasn't the pranks themselves. It was how Jake watched my reactions. He'd position himself where he could see my face during the moment of discovery. He had this habit of taking quick photos on his phone, claiming he was documenting the fun times we're having as roommates. My friends started avoiding the apartment. Jake would intercept visitors at the door, telling them I was sick or had canceled plans. He'd show them photos on his phone, pictures of me looking frustrated or upset from his pranks, and explain that I was going through a rough patch and wasn't really up for company. "I'm just looking out for him," he'd tell them. He's been pretty unstable lately. By month 4, I was isolated, constantly on edge, and starting to doubt my own sanity. Every morning felt like walking through a minefield. I'd check my coffee for salt, my shampoo for dish soap, my work bag for missing items. Jake seemed to feed off my anxiety. The more stressed I became, the more elaborate his pranks got. And he never, ever called them what they really were. When Someone systematically destroys your peace of mind and calls it humor. What do you call that? Waking up in a hospital bed with tubes down your throat changes your perspective on everything. The first face I saw belonged to Dr. Martinez, a kind-looking woman in her 50s who was checking my chart with a frown that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't good. "How are you feeling?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. My throat felt like I'd been gargling with razor blades, but I managed to croak out, "What happened to me?" Dr. Martinez pulled up a chair beside my bed. "You were poisoned," she said simply. "Someone mixed a significant amount of ammonia-based household cleaner into your food. If you hadn't gotten here when you did, we'd be having a very different conversation." The room started spinning again, just like it had in my kitchen. "Poisoned? That's impossible. I just ate leftover pizza from my own fridge." "I'm afraid it's not impossible," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "The toxicology report is very clear. This wasn't an accident or a contamination issue. Someone deliberately added this substance to something you consumed." My mind raced back to Jake's smirk in the ambulance, the way he'd watched me eat for months, his obsession with social experiments. "Doctor," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "My roommate knew about my allergies. I had a reaction to cleaning products last year, had to go to urgent care. He drove me there." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "That would explain why the reaction was so severe. Your medical history shows you have a documented sensitivity to ammonia compounds. Whoever did this knew exactly what would happen." She handed me a tablet showing security footage from our apartment building's hallway. "The police wanted you to see this when you were stable enough." The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., about 10 minutes after the ambulance had arrived. There was Jake, calmly walking out of our apartment building carrying a duffel bag and a small cooler. He didn't look panicked or worried. He looked satisfied. But here's what made my blood run cold. At 12:23 a.m., the footage shows Jake returning. This time he's running, looking frantic and concerned. He rushes past the camera toward our apartment, then back out again, presumably to discover that I was gone and call around to find out what hospital I'd been taken to. "He left right after the ambulance took me," I said, more to myself than to Dr. Martinez. "Then came back to play the worried roommate." "The paramedic said he was very convincing," she confirmed. "Claimed he'd been out getting groceries when he came home to find you missing. Said he was terrified something had happened to you." I stared at the tablet screen, watching Jake's performance on loop, the way he perfectly executed his fake panic, the calculated timing of his return, the duffel bag that suggested he'd been planning to disappear entirely before deciding to maintain his cover. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said softly. "When the police searched your apartment for evidence, they found the pizza box you ate from. It was the only item in your entire kitchen that tested positive for the cleaning product. Everything else was clean. So he specifically targeted that one slice." "It appears so. And based on the concentration levels, this wasn't a prank gone wrong. This was attempted murder." The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Murder. My roommate, the guy who helped me move in, who bought groceries with me, who I'd trusted with my spare keys and my personal space, had tried to kill me. "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dr. Martinez closed the tablet and stood up. "That's a question for the police to answer. But I can tell you this. You're incredibly lucky to be alive. A few more minutes or a slightly higher dose and we wouldn't be having this conversation." As she left the room, I lay back against the pillows and tried to process everything. Jake hadn't just been pranking me. He'd been grooming me, studying my reactions, isolating me from friends and documenting everything like some kind of sick research project. And I'd been the perfect victim, trusting, isolated, and completely unaware that I was living with a predator. The question that terrified me most wasn't why he'd done it. It was how many times he'd done it before. Being stuck in a hospital bed gives you a lot of time to think. "And call your sister." "Sarah," I said, when she picked up on the first ring. "I need your help with something, and it's going to sound crazy. My sister had always been the tech-savvy one in our family. If anyone could help me dig into Jake's background, it was her." Within an hour, She was sitting beside my hospital bed with her laptop, ready to play detective. "Okay, what do we know about this psychopath?" she asked, cracking her knuckles like she was preparing for battle. We started with the basics: Jake's full name, the references he'd given me when we first met, his supposed job in tech. What we found, or rather what we didn't find, was disturbing. "His LinkedIn profile is completely fake," Sarah said, scrolling through her screen. "The company he claims to work for has no record of any employee by that name. And look at this. All his job history only goes back 18 months. She pulled up his rental history next. 3 different apartments in the past 2 years, just like he told you. But look at the pattern of when he moved. Each lease had ended abruptly. No normal notice periods, no overlap for apartment hunting. Jake would disappear from one place and immediately appear at another, like he was running from something. "I want to talk to his previous roommates," I told Sarah. "Already on it," she said, pulling up a list of names and numbers. "I found 2 of them on social media. One blocked me immediately when I mentioned Jake's name, but the other one agreed to meet." The next day, a guy named Marcus came to visit me in the hospital. He looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder like he expected Jake to appear at any moment. "I should have warned you," were the first words out of his mouth. "When I saw Jake had a new roommate, I should have reached out, but I was scared he'd come after me again." Marcus told me a story that made my skin crawl. Jake had started with the same innocent pranks, switching items, hiding things, taking photos, but it had escalated to psychological torture. "He would gaslight me constantly," Marcus explained. "Move my things and then convince me I was losing my memory. He'd invite people over and tell them I was mentally unstable, show them photos of me having breakdowns that he'd secretly caused." "Did he ever try to hurt you physically?" I asked. Marcus nodded grimly. 3 times. Once he put something in my protein shake that made me violently sick. Another time he loosened the wheels on my bike. I crashed and ended up with a concussion. The final straw was when I woke up one night and caught him standing over my bed with a pillow. "What did you do?" "I moved out that same night, packed everything I could carry, and never came back. Left 3 months of rent on the table just to get away from him." Marcus leaned forward. "The crazy thing is, he texted me for weeks afterward, pretending like nothing happened, asking when I was coming back to get my stuff, sending pictures of himself cooking in our kitchen." Sarah had been taking notes throughout the conversation. "How did he choose you as a roommate?" "Same way he probably chose your brother," Marcus said. "I was new to the city, didn't know many people, seemed trusting and isolated. Jake hunts for victims who won't be immediately missed if something happens to them." After Marcus left, Sarah and I sat in stunned silence. We'd uncovered a pattern that was both terrifying and clear. Jake was a serial predator who used the roommate relationship to gain access to vulnerable victims. "We need to call the police," Sarah said. "Already did. Detective Rodriguez is coming by tomorrow to get Marcus's statement." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important. Jake was too careful, too methodical to leave. His behavior undocumented. Somewhere there was evidence of what he'd been doing to me and to others. "Sarah," I said, a terrible thought occurring to me. "What if there are more victims? What if some of them didn't survive?" She looked up from her laptop, and I could see the same fear in her eyes that was growing in my chest. "Then we need to find them before Jake finds his next target." 3 days later, I was finally stable enough to leave the hospital. Detective Rodriguez insisted on escorting me back to the apartment to collect evidence and my belongings. "We've been monitoring the place since your incident," she explained as we walked up to my front door. "Jake cleared out most of his stuff the day after you were hospitalized, but he left some things behind." The apartment felt different, colder, emptier, like a crime scene instead of a home. Jake's room was completely bare except for his desk, which the police had left untouched for me to see. "We wanted you to identify if anything here belonged to you before we processed it as evidence," Detective Rodriguez said, pulling on latex gloves. What I saw on that desk changed everything. There was a leather journal open to a page with my name written at the top in Jake's neat handwriting. Below it was a detailed timeline of every interaction we'd had, every prank he'd pulled, and my reaction to each one. But this wasn't just a record, it was a scientific study. Day 12. Subject: responded to salt-sugar switch with minor frustration, but attempted to reciprocate. Good sign of compliance. Day 28. Successfully isolated subject from friend group using unstable behavior narrative. Subject now relies primarily on me for social interaction. Day 67. Subject's stress levels have reached optimal range for next phase implementation. I felt sick reading it, but Detective Rodriguez encouraged me to continue. This is crucial evidence. Keep going. The entries got more disturbing as they progressed. Jake had been photographing me during his pranks, but also during private moments, sleeping, showering, eating. The photos were organized in clear plastic sleeves like a twisted scrapbook. 9. Subject's anxiety response to missing items now automatic. Pavlovian conditioning successful. Day 103. Tested subject's allergy sensitivity with trace amounts of cleaning product on doorknob. Mild reaction confirms medical records accurate. My hands were shaking as I turned to the final section of the journal. The page header read, Final phase implementation. Jake had detailed his plan to poison me with clinical precision. He'd researched the exact type of cleaning product that would trigger my specific allergies, calculated the dosage needed to cause a severe but not immediately fatal reaction, and even planned his alibi timeline down to the minute. But the most chilling part was his reasoning. Subject has provided optimal data for methodology refinement. Implementation of final phase will complete case study and allow for subject replacement. Subject replacement, I whispered. He was already planning to find someone new. Detective Rodriguez was photographing each page. Look at this, she said, pointing to a section I'd missed. He's got profiles on potential future subjects. There were 3 detailed profiles, complete with photos that Jake had somehow obtained. Names, ages, work schedules, living situations, even personality assessments. All 3 were young professionals, new to the city, living alone or looking for roommates. He was shopping for his next victim while he was still experimenting on me, I realized. It gets worse, Detective Rodriguez said, opening a filing cabinet that Jake had left behind. Look at this. Inside were folders labeled with names and dates going back 3 years. Each folder contained the same type of documentation, detailed journals, photographs, behavioral analysis, and final phase plans. There were 7 folders in total. 7 victims. Jesus, I breathed, opening one labeled Marcus Chen, the guy who'd visited me in the hospital. Jake's notes on Marcus followed the same pattern as mine, but his final phase had been different. Instead of poisoning, Jake had planned to stage an accident that would look like Marcus had fallen down the stairs. Marcus got out just in time, Detective Rodriguez observed. According to this timeline, Jake was planning to implement his final phase the week Marcus moved out. We found evidence of 2 other victims who hadn't been as lucky. The folders contained newspaper clippings about accidents, 1 apparent suicide, 1 case of severe food poisoning that had resulted in a coma. Both victims had been Jake's roommates. This isn't just attempted murder, I said, staring at the evidence spread across Jake's desk. This is serial killing disguised as roommate pranks. Detective Rodriguez was already on her radio, calling for backup and contacting other jurisdictions where Jake's previous accidents had occurred. We need to find him before he starts on a new victim. As if on cue, her phone rang. She answered quickly, listened for a moment, then looked at me with a grim expression. Jake's been arrested. Apparently he was already living with someone new. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with horror. Another innocent person had been in Jake's crosshairs, probably already being pranked and studied and prepared for their own final phase. Looking at the evidence scattered across that desk, the journals, the photos, the carefully planned murders disguised as accidents, I realized how close I'd come to becoming just another folder in Jake's filing cabinet, but this time, his perfect victim had survived. And now we had everything we needed to make sure Jake would never hurt anyone again. The trial took place 6 months later, and I'll never forget walking into that courtroom. Jake was sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit looking nothing like the clean-cut roommate who had once helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs. When our eyes met, he gave me that same tilted head smile that had made my skin crawl for months. Even facing multiple counts of attempted murder and conspiracy, he still thought this was all just an elaborate game. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "we're dealing with a defendant who systematically targeted vulnerable individuals, gained their trust through cohabitation, and then tortured them psychologically before attempting to murder them in ways designed to look accidental." The evidence we'd found in Jake's apartment was devastating. The prosecution presented his journals, photographs, and detailed plans to a jury that looked more horrified with each revelation. But the most powerful testimony came from his surviving victims. Marcus took the stand first, describing months of psychological manipulation and 3 separate attempts on his life. His voice shook as he recounted waking up to find Jake standing over his bed with a pillow. "I thought I was losing my mind," Marcus told the jury. "He convinced me I was paranoid, unstable, imagining threats that weren't there. Even after I moved out, I spent months in therapy trying to understand what had happened to me. Then it was my turn. Jake presented himself as the perfect roommate. I testified, my voice steadier than I'd expected. He was clean, reliable, and helpful. But within weeks, he began a systematic campaign of psychological torture designed to isolate me and study my responses to stress. I described the escalating pranks, the way Jake had driven away my friends, and his obsessive documentation of my reactions. When I got to the poisoning attempt, several jury members visibly recoiled. The defendant knew about my severe allergies to ammonia-based cleaning products. I continued. He'd driven me to urgent care the previous year when I'd had an accidental exposure. He used that medical knowledge to calculate a dose that would cause maximum suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. Jake's defense attorney tried to paint him as a harmless prankster whose jokes had accidentally gone too far. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. They presented testimony from the families of 2 previous victims who had died under suspicious circumstances while living with Jake. The turning point came when the prosecutor introduced Jake's own words from his journal. Implementation of EU. Final phase will complete case study and allow for subject replacement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor said, holding up the journal, these are not the words of someone playing pranks. These are the calculated notes of a predator who views human beings as expendable test subjects. During cross-examination, Jake's attorney made a critical error by putting Jake himself on the stand. Jake couldn't resist trying to charm the jury, explaining his social experiments and behavioral research like he was presenting at an academic conference. "I was studying human resilience," he said with that same unsettling smile. "How much stress can the average person handle before they break? It's fascinating research with real-world applications." "So you viewed your roommates as test subjects?" the prosecutor asked during redirect. "Well, yes, but willing participants. They consented to live with me." "Did they consent to being poisoned, Mr. Patterson?" Jake's pause was telling. "That was never the intended outcome, but it was the planned outcome according to your own journal entries." Jake's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the importance of the research. These people were contributing to something bigger than themselves." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts, 7 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of assault, psychological abuse, and stalking. The judge sentenced Jake to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "Mr. Patterson," the judge said before imposing sentence, "you have shown a complete disregard for human life and dignity. Your victims trusted you with their homes, their safety, and their lives. You repaid that trust with calculated cruelty and attempted murder. Society needs protection from predators like you." As they led Jake away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time to look at me. But the smirk was gone. For the first time since I'd known him, Jake looked genuinely surprised. His perfect experiment had failed. His carefully chosen victim had survived, fought back, and won. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Complete safety. 6 months after the trial, I was finally ready to talk about what had happened to me. not just to family and friends, but to strangers who might be living through their own version of hell with a roommate they trusted. I'd moved into a studio apartment, small but completely mine, and started seeing a therapist who specialized in psychological abuse. Trauma changes you, Dr. Williams told me during one of our sessions. But it doesn't have to define you. You can choose what to do with the experience. That's when I decided to start the support group. I put up flyers at local colleges, community centers, and online forums. Roommate Abuse Support Group for survivors of psychological manipulation, gaslighting, and abuse in shared living situations. You're not alone, and it wasn't your fault. The first meeting was just me and 2 other people in a community center conference room. Sarah, a college student whose roommate had been stealing her identity while convincing her she was losing her memory. And David, a recent graduate whose roommate had systematically sabotaged his job interviews while pretending to be supportive. I kept thinking I was going crazy, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She would move my things and then act concerned when I couldn't find them. She'd suggest I see a doctor about my memory problems. The worst part was the isolation, David added. He'd tell people I was unreliable, show them photos of me looking stressed or upset, photos he'd taken secretly during the moments when I was reacting to his sabotage. Their stories were hauntingly familiar. Different tactics, same pattern. Target isolated individuals, gain their trust, systematically break down their reality, then document their suffering. This is way more common than people realize, I told them. And it's not just roommates, it's intimate partners, family members, co-workers, anyone who has access to your daily life and uses that access to manipulate you. Our group grew quickly. Within 3 months, we had regular attendance of 15 to 20 people. We met twice a week, shared resources, and most importantly, validated each other's experiences. "You don't have to be physically hurt to be abused," became our group motto. Psychological torture is real, and your reactions to it are normal. I also started speaking at colleges and community events about recognizing the warning signs of roommate abuse. The response was overwhelming. Audience members would approach me afterward with their own stories, asking for advice or just wanting someone to believe them. "Trust your instincts," I'd tell them. If someone's behavior makes you uncomfortable, you don't owe them the benefit of the doubt. Your safety matters more than being polite. The hardest part of healing wasn't dealing with the trauma, it was dealing with the guilt. Guilt over trusting Jake, guilt over not seeing the warning signs sooner, guilt over the other victims who hadn't survived. Predators are experts at manipulation, Dr. Williams reminded me repeatedly. That's what makes them dangerous. You were targeted specifically because you were a good person, trusting, empathetic, willing to give others the benefit of the doubt. Those aren't character flaws. Learning to trust people again took time. I'd catch myself analyzing new friends and colleagues looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. But gradually, with therapy and the support group, I started to rebuild my ability to form healthy relationships. The most important lesson I learned was about boundaries. Before Jake, I'd been a people pleaser who avoided conflict at all costs. I'd ignored red flags because I didn't want to seem mean or paranoid. Now I know that setting boundaries isn't mean, it's essential. Trusting your instincts isn't paranoid, it's survival. If you're reading this and something about your living situation feels wrong, please listen to that feeling. You deserve to feel safe in your own home. You deserve roommates who respect your boundaries and your well-being. And if someone tells you that their harmful behavior is just a joke or that you're too sensitive, remember this. Real friends don't systematically make you feel unsafe, anxious, or doubt your own sanity. You're not overreacting, you're not too sensitive, and you're definitely not alone. 2 years after Jake's conviction, I thought that chapter of my life was finally closed. Then I got the phone call from Warden Stevens at the state penitentiary. "Mr. Thompson, I'm calling because Jake Patterson has been attempting to contact you through our mail system. His letters have been intercepted per the restraining order, but I thought you should know about their content." My blood ran cold. "What kind of content?" "He claims he's found religion, completed anger management programs, and wants to apologize for what he did to you. He's been very persistent, writing multiple letters per week for the past month. I should have hung up right there. Should have thanked the warden and forgotten about it. But something made me ask the question I knew I'd regret. What do the letters actually say? Warden Stevens paused. Would you like me to read you excerpts? I want to warn you, though. They're quite manipulative. The first letter started exactly how I'd expected. Dear friend, I know I have no right to contact you, but I've been doing a lot of soul searching in here. I found God and realized how wrong I was about everything. Classic Jake, the perfect opening designed to make me lower my guard. But as the warden continued reading, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Jake wasn't just claiming to be reformed, he was rewriting history entirely. I never meant to hurt you, the warden read. What happened was a terrible accident that got blown out of proportion by overzealous prosecutors. I was just trying to help you build resilience and confidence through friendly challenges. Friendly challenges, I repeated, my voice flat. He's calling attempted murder friendly challenges. It gets worse, Warden Stevens continued. He's been telling other inmates that he was wrongfully convicted, that you and the other victims conspired against him out of jealousy. Several inmates have reported that he's trying to recruit them to contact you on his behalf once they're released. My worst fears were confirmed. Jake hadn't changed at all. He was still playing his games, still manipulating people, still viewing other human beings as pawns in his twisted experiments. There's something else you should know, the warden added. Jake has been befriending vulnerable inmates, offering to help them with legal appeals and job placement after release. Then he starts asking detailed questions about their personal lives, their families, their fears. Even in prison, Jake was hunting for victims. What are you doing to stop him? I asked. We've moved him to administrative segregation and flagged his communications for review, but I wanted to warn you because 3 of the inmates he was mentoring are scheduled for release in the next 6 months. That night, I called Detective Rodriguez, who had become something of a friend over the past 2 years. She wasn't surprised by the news. Sociopaths don't change, she told me bluntly. They just get better at hiding who they really are. Jake's letters are probably part of some larger manipulation, maybe trying to build grounds for an appeal or laying groundwork for when he eventually gets out. He got life without parole, he's never getting out. Appeals happen, sentences get reduced, and Jake's smart enough to play the long game. Her words haunted me for weeks. Jake was still out there, still manipulating people, still causing harm from behind bars. The system had stopped him from killing, but it hadn't stopped him from being who he fundamentally was, a predator. I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to let Jake control my life anymore, not even from prison. Instead of living in fear of his manipulation, I was going to use my experience to help others recognize predators like him. I expanded our support group into a non-profit organization, started working with law enforcement to train officers on recognizing patterns of psychological abuse, and began consulting with apartment management companies on tenant screening procedures. Most importantly, I started speaking publicly about Jake's letters and his continued manipulation attempts. Because the scariest thing about predators isn't what they do to their victims, it's how they never really stop hunting. Jake Patterson is serving life in prison, but that doesn't mean he's powerless. He's still manipulating people, still studying human behavior, still treating other people like experimental subjects. The difference is that now I know who he really is. And I'm not keeping that knowledge to myself anymore. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And when someone tries to convince you that their harmful behavior's actually good for you, run. Some people never change. But that doesn't mean you have to be their victim twice. If you've experienced roommate abuse, psychological manipulation, or gaslighting, please know that help is available. Trust your instinct, document everything, and don't let anyone convince you that abuse is normal or deserved. You can find resources and support at the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, or by searching for local victim advocacy organizations. And if this story resonated with you, please share it. The more people who understand these Manipulation tactics, the fewer victims predators like Jake will be able to claim.